Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes courage isn't enough. Sometimes even the best medical science and the most devoted friends cannot save someone who has been marked by darkness, claimed by a predator who exists beyond the reach of mortal intervention. Professor Abraham Van Helsing knew this truth the moment he examined Lucy Westenra and saw the signs he had hoped never to see again. The telltale wounds, the progressive anemia, the sleepwalking toward death, the scent of the grave already clinging to someone still technically alive. He had fought this enemy before, in other countries, other centuries it seemed, and he had learned that vampires don't simply kill their victims. They seduce them, corrupt them, transform them into willing participants in their own destruction. Lucy's suitors, Arthur with his wealth and title, Quincy with his frontier courage, John with his scientific mind, would give everything to save her, their blood literally drained to replace what the creature stole, their sleep sacrificed to maintain protective vigils, their beliefs shattered and rebuilt around the terrible knowledge that the dead can walk and feed and spread their corruption like a plague. But Van Helsing knew something they hadn't yet accepted. Lucy was already lost. The question wasn't whether they could save her, but whether they could save her soul, and whether they could stop the monster before it claimed more victims, before it turned their dying friend into another predator haunting the night. The sleepwalker's dream was ending, and the nightmare that followed would test everything they were, everything they believed, everything they were willing to sacrifice to fight an evil that predated civilization itself. Professor Abraham Van Helsing arrived in Whitby on a grey afternoon when the sea churned restless and violent against the shore, as though nature itself sensed the wrongness poisoning the town. He was a striking figure despite his age, tall and vigorous with wild grey hair and eyes that seemed to look through surfaces to the truths beneath, eyes that had seen things most men would dismiss as impossible. Dr. John Seward met him at the station, gratitude and worry etched equally on his young face, and during the carriage ride to the cottage where Lucy lay, he explained everything. The progressive weakness, the throat wounds, the sleepwalking, Mina's account of the figure in the graveyard that vanished like smoke. Van Helsing listened in grave silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled, and when Seward finished he sat for a long moment before speaking. "John, my friend, my student, you have called me here because you trust my expertise with unusual cases, yes? You know my reputation for solving medical mysteries that baffle others. But you must prepare yourself for a possibility your scientific training has not equipped you to accept. What if this is not a medical mystery at all? What if the explanation lies outside the realm of science, in territories your rational mind will want to reject?" Seward had frowned, uncertain how to respond, and Van Helsing had gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. "Keep an open mind. That is all I ask. The world is older and stranger than our textbooks acknowledge. There are forces, entities, that predate our modern understanding, that operate according to rules we have forgotten or never knew. Promise me you will not dismiss what I tell you simply because it contradicts your training." The promise had been given, though Seward clearly didn't understand what he was promising, and they'd arrived at the cottage to find Mina keeping vigil beside Lucy, who lay unconscious and pale as death, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the sheets. Van Helsing's examination was thorough and professional, but Mina noticed details that seemed odd for a medical consultation. The way he tested Lucy's reaction to a small crucifix held near her face, how he sniffed the air around her bed as though scent could diagnose disease, the way his hands trembled slightly when he examined the wounds on her throat. When he finished, he gestured for Mina and Seward to join him in the next room, leaving Lucy's mother, who had arrived from London that morning, to sit with her daughter. Mrs. Westenra was beside herself with worry but convinced this was some ordinary illness that proper medical care would resolve, and Van Helsing had chosen not to enlighten her otherwise. In the small parlour, he faced them with an expression of terrible certainty. "What I am about to tell you will sound like madness, like medieval superstition, and every rational bone in your bodies will resist believing it. But I have seen this before, twice, once in Prussia and once in my native Holland, and both times I arrived too late to save the victim. I pray I am not too late now." He paused, gathering himself. "Miss Westenra is being preyed upon by a vampire, one of the Nosferatu, the undead who sustain their cursed existence by drinking the blood of the living." The silence that followed was absolute. Seward's face showed shock warring with disbelief, a doctor's rational mind rejecting the diagnosis even as his memory of Van Helsing's reputation demanded he at least consider it. Mina's reaction was different, a terrible recognition, pieces falling into place, the figure in the graveyard, the abandoned ship, the strange dog, all of it making sudden horrible sense. "The man I saw," she whispered. "In the graveyard. He said Lucy was his, that she was marked. I thought he was mad, or I was dreaming, but he was telling the truth, wasn't he? He's not human. He's this vampire, this creature, and he's been feeding on her." Van Helsing nodded gravely. "You saw him clearly. Can you describe him?" Mina did, her voice steady despite the fear, and Van Helsing's expression darkened with each detail. A nobleman by his bearing and dress, aristocratic features, an accent suggesting Eastern Europe. This matches reports I received months ago, rumors of an ancient vampire leaving his ancestral lands, seeking new hunting grounds in the West. I did not give them sufficient credence. I thought surely such a creature would not dare England, would not risk the attention of modern authorities and scientific investigation. I was wrong, and this girl is paying the price for my skepticism." Seward had been shaking his head throughout this exchange, and now he spoke, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. "Professor, with all respect, this is insane. Vampires are folklore, superstition, peasant tales to frighten children. There must be a rational explanation, a rare disease perhaps, or a madman who believes himself a vampire and is attacking Lucy, or the world contains wonders and terrors your education never mentioned," Van Helsing interrupted, not unkindly. "I understand your resistance, John. I felt the same when I first encountered evidence of the supernatural. But consider the facts without your preconceptions. A ship arrives with a dead crew and no living pilot. A mysterious stranger appears in the same town at the same time. A healthy young woman develops progressive anemia despite no source of blood loss you can identify. She sleepwalks to graveyards where a figure waits for her. She has puncture wounds on her throat that look like no insect bite you've ever seen. And she grows weaker each day despite rest and nourishment. What diagnosis fits those symptoms better than the one I've given you?" Seward had no answer, and his silence was acceptance of a sort, a willingness to at least entertain the impossible. Van Helsing turned to Mina. "You have been a good friend to Miss Westenra, brave and loyal. That friendship will be tested severely in the days ahead. The vampire has fed on her multiple times, taken a significant amount of her blood and with it, her life force. She is dangerously weak. We must replace what he has stolen, by her strength, and then we must protect her absolutely, prevent him from accessing her again. If we fail, if he feeds even once or twice more, she will die. And death will not be the end of her suffering." "What do you mean?" Mina asked, though some part of her already knew, already understood the full horror. "Those who die from vampire predation do not rest peacefully," Van Helsing said quietly. "They rise again, transformed into vampires themselves, cursed to the same undead existence as their destroyer. They become predators, hunters of their own kind, their humanity stripped away and replaced with insatiable hunger. Lucy would become like him, would feed on the innocent, would be damned for eternity. We must prevent that at all costs." The weight of it settled over them like a shroud. Not just Lucy's life at stake, but her soul, her eternal fate, and the lives of everyone she might victimize if the transformation completed. Mina felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. Lucy needed her strong, needed all of them strong. "What do we do?" she asked simply. Van Helsing laid out his plan with military precision. First, a blood transfusion, the same procedure Seward had performed on other patients to restore Lucy's strength. Arthur Homewood was already en route from London, having received an urgent telegram about his fiancée's illness, and his blood would be used first, young and healthy and enhanced by the power of his love. Then, protections, garlic flowers hung around Lucy's room and woven into wreaths for her to wear, their scent anathema to vampires. Crucifixes blessed by priests positioned at every entrance. Windows sealed and watched. And most importantly, continuous vigil, someone awake and alert every moment, preventing Lucy from sleepwalking and ensuring the vampire could not enter. "He must have an invitation to enter a dwelling," Van Helsing explained. "This is one of the rules that binds his kind, a limitation placed on their power. He cannot cross the threshold unless welcomed by someone with authority to welcome him. But Lucy in her sleep trance state may have invited him already, or her mother might innocently do so if he presents himself as a concerned friend. We must ensure everyone understands that no one, absolutely no one, is to be admitted to this house after dark, regardless of who they claim to be or how urgent their business seems." Arthur arrived that evening, having driven his carriage at reckless speed from London, his handsome face haggard with worry. Van Helsing met him privately, explaining in gentle but firm terms that Lucy's life hung by a thread and that Arthur must trust him completely, must follow instructions without question even if they seemed strange. Arthur, his love for Lucy overriding all other considerations, agreed immediately, and within the hour the transfusion began. Mina watched from the doorway as Arthur sat beside Lucy's bed, his arm connected to hers by rubber tubing, his blood flowing into her veins to replace what the vampire had stolen. Lucy remained unconscious throughout the procedure, but as Arthur's blood entered her system, her color improved slightly, her breathing deepened, small signs of returning vitality. Arthur's face grew progressively paler as his own strength drained, but he refused Van Helsing's suggestion that they'd taken enough, insisted he could give more, would give everything if it meant saving her. Finally Van Helsing called a halt, disconnecting the tubes and helping Arthur to a chair where he sat dizzy and weak but smiling, satisfied that he'd done something tangible to help. "You have given her life, my friend," Van Helsing said, his hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Your blood is strong and pure, and it will sustain her. But this is only the beginning. The creature will sense what we've done, will return to reclaim what he believes is his. We must be ready." The protections were installed with meticulous care. Van Helsing had brought garlic flowers from London, had harvested them specifically for this purpose, and he wove them into wreaths that filled the room with their pungent scent. He hung them over the windows and door, placed them around Lucy's neck despite Mrs. Westenra's protests about the smell, and stationed crucifixes at every possible entrance. The windows were not only sealed but watched, Seward and Quincy Morris, who had arrived with Arthur, taking turns maintaining vigil throughout the night. Quincy was an interesting addition to the group, his American forthrightness and frontier experience making him uniquely suited to the coming fight. Where Seward questioned and Arthur worried, Quincy simply accepted Van Helsing's explanations and asked practical questions. What weapons worked against vampires, how to kill them, whether his Winchester rifle would be of any use. Van Helsing warmed to him immediately, recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who understood that when faced with impossible evil, you didn't waste time debating its existence, you simply fought with every tool available. "Silver bullets, they do nothing," Van Helsing explained as they prepared for the night's vigil. "Traditional weapons are largely ineffective. The vampire must be decapitated or a wooden stake driven through the heart while it rests in its coffin during daylight hours. It can be held at bay with crucifixes and garlic, with running water which it cannot cross without assistance, with sacred objects and prayers. Sunlight is deadly to it, will reduce it to dust in moments. But at night, in darkness, it is tremendously powerful, can take the form of wolf or bat or mist, can command lesser creatures, can entrance the weak-willed with a glance. We are not fighting a mortal enemy, gentlemen. We are fighting something that has survived centuries, that has killed thousands, that views us as cattle, as food. Our only advantages are knowledge, faith, and the fact that we fight for love while it fights only for hunger. The speech should have sounded absurd, should have prompted laughter or disbelief, but delivered in Van Helsing's grave certain tone, it instead prompted grim determination. They were three men who loved the same woman, who under normal circumstances might have been rivals, but crisis had transformed them into brothers, united by a common cause. They would save Lucy or die trying, and the depth of their commitment was absolute. The first night passed without incident, Lucy sleeping peacefully under the protection of garlic and crucifix, the transfused blood giving her strength enough to rest naturally rather than the deathly unconsciousness of previous nights. Dawn came as a relief, and Van Helsing allowed himself cautious optimism. Perhaps the protections would hold. Perhaps the vampire would seek easier prey. Perhaps Lucy would survive. But the second night shattered that optimism. Mrs. Westenra, well-meaning but ignorant of the true danger, had found the garlic wreaths distasteful, had worried about their effect on Lucy's breathing, and in a moment when the watchers were distracted had removed them from her daughter's neck and opened a window to air out the room. It was only a few minutes, she would later sob, only wanting her daughter to breathe fresh air instead of that terrible smell, but those few minutes were enough. Quincy, on watch at the time, had stepped into the corridor to speak with Seward about the watch rotation, and when he returned the window was open, the garlic wreath lay on the floor, and something was in the room, a dark shape that moved like mist and smoke, that seemed to have no fixed form. He'd shouted and rushed forward, and the thing had solidified briefly into the form of a massive bat, eyes glowing red in the darkness, before dissolving again and flowing out the open window into the night. Lucy lay unconscious again, her throat bearing fresh wounds, her face pale as a corpse, and Van Helsing's examination showed she'd lost nearly all the blood Arthur had given her. The vampire had fed deeply, greedily, had sensed the fresh blood in her veins and taken it as his due. Mrs. Westenra collapsed in hysterics, understanding finally that she'd nearly killed her own daughter, and had to be sedated and removed to another room where she couldn't cause further damage through ignorant kindness. Another transfusion became necessary, Seward volunteering this time, sitting beside Lucy and giving his blood while his face drained of color and his strength flowed into her veins. Van Helsing restored the protections, doubled them, and instituted new rules. The garlic was not to be touched for any reason, the windows were to remain sealed regardless of smell or discomfort, and Mrs. Westenra was not to be left alone with Lucy under any circumstances. "He is more determined than I anticipated," Van Helsing admitted to Mina during a quiet moment. "Most vampires are patient, willing to feed slowly over weeks or months. But this one attacks repeatedly, aggressively, as though he has a deadline, as though he's working against some schedule we don't understand. It suggests planning, purpose beyond simple feeding. He doesn't merely want Lucy's blood, he wants her transformation, wants to create another of his kind, and soon." The pattern continued for days, a terrible rhythm of protective vigil and vampire attack, of blood transfusions buying Lucy temporary strength that the creature drained away again at the first opportunity. Each man gave blood in turn, Arthur, then Seward, then Quincy, and finally Van Helsing himself, though he was oldest and could least afford the loss. They were sustaining her through sheer determination, replacing her blood faster than the vampire could steal it, but all of them knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually their own health would fail, or Lucy's body would simply give out, unable to withstand the repeated trauma. And through it all, Lucy herself seemed increasingly detached from her own struggle, sleeping more and more, and when she woke she spoke of dreams, beautiful dreams of flying and freedom, of a dark lover who promised her eternity, who told her that death was not an ending but a beginning, that she could join him in the night and they would hunt together, would soar on wings of shadow, would live forever beyond the reach of mortality and decay. "Don't you see," she'd say to Mina during her lucid moments, her voice dreamy and distant, "he's offering me something beautiful. Everyone dies eventually, but he's giving me the chance to transcend death, to become something more than human. Why are you fighting so hard to keep me mortal when immortality is within reach?" These speeches terrified Mina more than the physical symptoms, because they showed the vampire's psychological hold, the seduction that made victims complicit in their own destruction. Lucy was beginning to want the transformation, to long for it, and that wanting was the final stage before the point of no return. Van Helsing recognized it too, and his expression grew increasingly grave. "We are losing her," he confided to the men during a midnight conference while Lucy slept under Mina's watch. "Not just her blood but her will, her desire to remain human. The vampire's influence is strong, works on the mind as much as the body. She is beginning to see him as a savior rather than destroyer, to view her friends as jailers preventing her from achieving some great destiny. When that transformation of perspective completes, when she actively welcomes him rather than passively succumbing, the protections will fail. She will invite him in herself, and no amount of garlic or crucifixes will prevent what follows." "Then what do we do?" Arthur demanded, his voice ragged from exhaustion and fear and the blood loss from repeated transfusions. "How do we save her if she won't save herself?" Van Helsing was silent for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke his voice carried a weight of terrible sorrow. "There may come a point where we cannot save her life, only her soul. If she transforms fully, if she dies and rises again as one of them, we will have to destroy her. It is the only mercy we can offer, to release her soul before it becomes trapped in an undead body, damned to prey on the innocent for eternity. I know this is agonizing to contemplate, but you must be prepared for the possibility. You must be ready to do what love demands, even if what it demands is the hardest thing imaginable." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Mina, listening from the doorway, felt her heart break for Arthur, for all of them, for Lucy most of all. They were discussing murdering the woman they loved to save her from a fate worse than death, and the gothic horror of it, the medieval nightmare bleeding into their modern rational world, was almost too much to bear. But bear it they must, because the alternative was unthinkable. Lucy transformed into a predator, Lucy stalking children in the night, Lucy damned and lost forever to the darkness. Better to kill her themselves, with love and prayers and grief, than to let her become that. The crisis came on the 7th night, when Lucy's strength had been failing despite all their efforts, when even Van Helsing's most powerful protection seemed inadequate against the vampire's determination. She lay unconscious, barely breathing, her skin so pale it was translucent, showing the blue tracery of veins beneath. The men kept vigil around her bed, none of them sleeping, all of them knowing this was likely the final night one way or another. Midnight came and passed. The house was silent except for the ticking of clocks and the soft sound of prayers from Van Helsing's lips, old Dutch prayers his mother had taught him, prayers against evil and darkness. And then, from outside, a sound, scratching at the window, persistent and rhythmic, and a voice, cultured and seductive, speaking Lucy's name. "Lucy, my darling, my bride, let me in. You're suffering unnecessarily, letting these fools prolong your pain when I offer release. Let me in and I will end your agony, will transform you into something beautiful and eternal. Let me in, Lucy. Invite me across the threshold and embrace your destiny." Lucy's eyes opened, though she shouldn't have had the strength, and she turned her head toward the window where a dark shape pressed against the glass, and her lips parted to speak, to give the invitation that would doom her, and Van Helsing lunged forward with a crucifix, pressing it to her forehead, the metal sizzling against her skin like a brand. Lucy screamed, a sound of agony and rage that didn't seem human, and the shape at the window hissed and retreated, and Lucy fell back unconscious, a burn mark in the shape of a cross now marring her perfect forehead. "It has begun," Van Helsing said quietly, pulling his hand away, tears streaming down his weathered face. The transformation. She is becoming one of them. The crucifix burned her, you see? She is no longer purely human, no longer purely innocent. The vampire's essence is spreading through her, corrupting her, and soon, very soon, the change will complete. Arthur knelt beside the bed, taking Lucy's limp hand, pressing it to his lips, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Quincy and Seward stood like statues, faces frozen in expressions of grief and horror. And outside the window, fading into the pre-dawn darkness, came the sound of laughter, triumphant and cruel, the laugh of a predator who knew he'd won, who knew the woman was lost to the light and soon would join him in eternal darkness. Mina entered the room, her face wet with tears, and knelt beside Van Helsing. There must be something else we can do. Some other protection. Some weapon we haven't tried. Please, there must be something. Van Helsing gripped her hands, his own trembling with age and exhaustion and sorrow. There is one thing, one final hope. We must find him during the day, find where he rests, and destroy him in his coffin before nightfall. If he is truly dead, the curse may lift from Lucy, may release her before the transformation completes. It is a slim hope, but it is all we have left. Then we hunt, Quincy said, his voice hard as iron despite the grief in his eyes. We find this demon and we end him. Whatever it takes. And so the plan was set, the desperate gamble that would require them to locate the vampire's lair, to face him in the place where he slept, to destroy a creature that had survived centuries and killed thousands. The odds were impossible, the danger absolute, but love demanded the attempt, and they would give everything to save Lucy's soul even if her life was already forfeit. Outside, dawn broke over Whitby, grey and cold, and in a rented house near the waterfront, in a coffin filled with Transylvanian earth, Count Dracula slept the sleep of the undead, dreaming of his golden bride who was so close to transformation, so close to joining him forever in the beautiful darkness, and when he woke with the setting sun he would return to claim her, to complete what he'd begun, to create the first of his English vampires and begin building his empire of night. The race was on. Predator and protectors both preparing for the final confrontation. And Lucy, suspended between life and death, human and monster, slept on, unaware that her fate and the fate of countless others hung in the balance, waiting to be decided by courage or cowardice, by love or fear, by the strength of those who fought for light against the eternal hunger of the dark.